One week before my 35th birthday, I was full of excitement. I had planned a dinner party for close friends and family, and booked a quiet, beautiful restaurant known for its view and calm lighting. I had just been promoted, and I felt proud of myself, and I wanted that night to be special. I had chosen a burgundy dress with soft sleeves, and wore my hair in a simple wave. My husband Adam had told me he would take care of the cake, and I appreciated the gesture, since he rarely showed interest in planning things. He seemed extra quiet the past few days, but I thought maybe he was just tired from work. My sister Lila called me that morning and asked if I was still wearing heels and joked that I would regret it halfway through dinner. I laughed and said I was stubborn like always, and we talked about seating arrangements since she could be a little dramatic if she did not sit close to the center of attention. Lila was younger than me by 3 years, and we had always had a complicated relationship. She was the kind of person who entered a room and expected it to rotate around her, and I had spent most of my life dimming myself so she could shine brighter. She was always the beautiful one, the loud one, the one who got what she wanted. Our parents enabled it, even when we were children, and I learned early that if I wanted peace I had to let her win. I never imagined she would cross the line that night and destroy the last thread I had been holding onto Adam, and I arrived a few minutes late because traffic had slowed us down, and as we walked in everyone clapped, and I smiled wide. My mother hugged me and told me I looked radiant, and my dad gave me a quick nod, which was his version of approval. The table was decorated with small candles and rose petals, and I noticed my best friend Kara had already taken photos of the setup and sent them to our group chat. Everything looked beautiful and normal, just the way I had pictured it. Lila stood up and gave me a hug and whispered happy birthday in a voice that sounded overly sweet. She was wearing a pale pink dress which clashed with her usual bold style, and I thought it was strange but didn't say anything. Adam took the seat next to mine, and Lila sat directly across from us. She kept looking at me in short bursts, then turning to whisper something to her friend Dana, who giggled more than necessary as we began eating. I noticed Adam was picking at his food. I asked if everything was all right, and he smiled quickly and said he was fine, but his knee kept bouncing under the table, and he would not meet my eyes. The tension started to crawl over my skin, and I brushed it off by focusing on the food and trying to stay present. We went through appetizers and main courses, and laughter floated around the table like soft music. For a moment, I relaxed. I told a story about a meeting at work that had gone wrong, and everyone laughed. Even my dad cracked a smile. Lila leaned in with a glass of juice and said she had an announcement, and that was when my heart began to race. Everyone turned to her, and she looked right at me, then at Adam, and then back at me. She said she had been keeping a secret, and that she was finally ready to share her happiness. Her eyes glistened as she said, "I am pregnant," and everyone gasped and clapped. And then she added, "And the father is someone you all know." And then, without a pause, she looked at Adam and smiled like a knife sliding into my chest. The room fell silent. I stared at her, thinking I had misunderstood. But then I looked at Adam, and he looked down at his plate, as if it held all the answers. I said, "What?" And Lila nodded and said, "Yes, it is Adam, and we are in love, and we did not mean to fall for each other, but it happened, and we are having a baby." Everyone around the table froze. Even my mother dropped her fork, and my dad looked like he had been slapped. I could not breathe. I could not move. I just stared at the two of them sitting across from each other like they had not just ripped through my spine and left me exposed. I asked Adam if it was true, and he nodded without speaking, then finally said, "It just happened, and I am sorry." And he said it in the smallest voice I had ever heard him use. The room erupted. Kara stood up and asked if this was a joke, and my uncle shook his head like he was watching a slow disaster. And my mother began crying softly and whispering, "How could you?" Lila looked proud, like she had been waiting for this moment for weeks. I stood up slowly. I felt the ground tilt under my feet and the candlelight blurred everything. I walked out without saying another word, and behind me I heard voices raised, some calling after me. But I did not stop. I got in my car and sat there gripping the steering wheel, trying not to scream. My phone buzzed, and it was Kara texting, "Are you okay? Do you want me to come to you?" I replied, "No, I just want to be alone." That night, I drove aimlessly through the city with my makeup smudged and my hands shaking. I thought about all the signs I had ignored, the way Lila always touched Adam's arm during family gatherings, the way he laughed louder Her jokes, the way she once wore my perfume after borrowing it, and said it reminded her of someone she liked, the memory stabbed me, and I pulled over near the lake and stared at the water for a long time. I wanted to scream, to cry, to hit something, but I just sat there feeling empty. I had loved Adam. For 8 years we had been through ups and downs, and I never thought he would do this to me, especially not with my sister. The betrayal felt like it had no bottom, no, and just a free fall into darkness. I thought about what to do next, and for the first time in years I had no plan. I just sat there with the sound of waves hitting the shore and my world crashing around me silently. I spent the rest of that night parked by the lake, just staring at the ripples in the water as they caught the streetlights that flickered behind me and reflected them like broken stars. I kept thinking over and over, how did I get here? How did my husband and my own sister betray me in a way that felt worse than death? I was not just grieving the loss of a marriage or a sibling bond. I was mourning the person I used to be, the woman who trusted too easily, who ignored every warning sign just to keep the peace. I finally drove home in the early hours of the morning. The streets were quiet, the air heavy with the kind of silence that felt cruel. I walked into our apartment, which still smelled like the vanilla candle I had lit the night before, and stood there frozen in the doorway, like I was trespassing in a life that no longer belonged to me. The photos on the wall of Adam and me at our wedding, of us on vacations, of silly moments, now looked like evidence of a lie. I sat on the couch, not even bothering to change my clothes. The heels pinched my feet, but I could not feel them through the numbness. I had no idea where Adam had gone after the dinner, and I did not care. I turned off my phone. I needed space from the apologies, the questions, the fake sympathy. I needed space from the entire world. The next day, I called in sick to work and stayed under the covers, barely moving, only getting up to drink water or sit in the shower fully clothed until the water ran cold. I did not cry, not yet. It was like my body refused to process it because admitting it would make it real. I thought about how Lila looked when she said she was pregnant, like she was waiting for applause, like this was some twisted victory. I remembered how Adam refused to look me in the eye, and it made my stomach churn. I stayed in that state for 3 days, isolated in silence, until finally I forced myself to call Kara. She came over right away and hugged me so tightly I almost broke. Right then I told her everything, every suspicion, every moment I had brushed off, every time I thought something was strange, and she listened without interrupting, just holding my hand and nodding when I needed it. She offered to help me pack my things or kick Adam out or do anything I wanted, but I told her I did not know what I wanted. I just knew I could not breathe in that apartment anymore. That evening, I left a note on the table and packed a bag with a few clothes and my important documents and went to stay at Kara's place. She made up the guest room with fresh sheets and tea on the nightstand. And that small kindness cracked something inside me, and I cried for hours. She held me through it and said nothing, just letting me finally fall apart. I stayed there for a week. I avoided all calls and messages from my parents, who were trying to figure out what to do. My mom left voicemails begging me to talk to her. My dad sent one message that said I am disappointed in them. Both I did not reply. I needed time to think. I needed to figure out who I was outside of the roles I had played all my life: wife, sister, daughter, quiet peacekeeper. I met with a lawyer after Kara insisted on it, and I started the process of filing for divorce. I felt nothing when I signed the first set of documents, just a dull ache in my chest that I assumed would stay for a long time. During that week, Lila tried to message me several times, at first pretending she was sorry, that she did not mean for it to come out like that, and that she wanted to explain. Then, when I ignored her, she switched tactics and said I was being immature and that I had no right to act like the victim. I blocked her after that. I could not hear her voice or read her words without feeling like I was going to explode. I needed distance. Adam tried too. He sent a few texts asking if we could talk, if I could hear his side, but I did not care about his side. I had already lived it and suffered through it, and I was done being the woman who forgives betrayal just because it came with an apology. My parents asked me to come over for dinner to talk things through, and I almost refused, but then I decided I needed to face them, so I went and walked into their house with my head held high even though my hands were shaking. We sat at the kitchen table like strangers. My mom looked tired, her hair pulled back tightly, her eyes red. My dad stared at the table, avoiding eye contact. They asked how I was, and I told them I was surviving. My mother said she could not believe Lila had done this and that she felt like she failed us both. My dad stayed quiet until I asked him what he thought, and he said he never liked Adam and that he always suspected Lila would cause chaos one day, but he never imagined this level of damage. I told them I was getting a divorce and moving into a new apartment soon, and my mom cried again, but I stayed firm. I was not going to let anyone pull me back into that toxic cycle. They told me Lila had moved in with Adam and that she had been bragging to some family members about starting over, like she had won something. That stung more than I wanted to admit. I left that night knowing I would not be coming back for a long time, maybe never. I started therapy 2 days later because I knew I could not climb out of this alone. I needed to talk to someone who would not judge, who would help me rebuild myself from the ruins. My therapist listened as I described the betrayal and the pain and the patterns that had followed me from childhood, how I always made myself small so others could feel big, and how I sacrificed my own happiness for peace. We began untangling those threads one by one, and I started to see things clearer. It was not just about Adam and Lila, it was about years of being silent, about years of swallowing my truth to keep others comfortable. It took weeks before I could laugh again, really laugh, not the fake kind, but the real loud laugh that makes your stomach hurt. I found that laugh during a walk with Kara when she slipped on a patch of grass and we both ended up on the ground laughing like teenagers. I started painting again, something I had not done in years, and I remembered what it felt like to create something just for me, not to please anyone else, not to impress, just to express. I signed the final divorce papers exactly 4 weeks after that dinner, and when I left the lawyer's office, I felt a strange calm. It was done, the chapter was closed, and I had survived it. I did not know what the next part of my life would look like, but for the first time in years, it would be mine, entirely mine. The weeks that followed were a strange blur of silence, therapy paperwork, and moments where I felt like I was finally learning how to breathe without needing anyone's permission. I had found a small apartment on the other side of the city. It was not fancy, but it had large windows, a quiet kitchen, and floors that creaked in a way that made it feel alive. I painted the walls a soft blue and bought second-hand furniture from an online group. Kara helped me hang fairy lights in the living room, and on the first night in my new space, I sat on the floor with a cup of tea and stared at the empty walls. It felt like peace. I blocked Adam and Lila on everything, but that did not stop people from talking. My cousin forwarded me a post Lila made where she announced her pregnancy with a photo of her and Adam smiling on a couch, my old couch, and in the caption she wrote something about second chances and finding love where you least expect it. I did not respond. I refused to give her the power to pull me back into her drama. I kept going to therapy every week, digging deeper into the pieces of myself that I had ignored for so long. My therapist once asked me what would happen if I stopped trying to protect people who hurt me, and I cried for 20 straight minutes without answering because I had never given myself that permission. I started writing in a journal, something I had not done since I was a teenager. I wrote letters to myself, letters I would never send to Adam or Lila, letters that said everything I could never say out loud. I wrote about my rage, my grief, my confusion, and eventually about my hope. I began volunteering on weekends at a shelter for women who had gone through betrayal or abuse, and being there reminded me I was not alone, that pain had many faces, and so did strength. I met women who had lost more than I could imagine and still showed up with kindness and fire in their hearts, and they became my silent mentors, teaching me how to stand tall again. One day, I walked into a coffee shop near my apartment and saw Lila sitting at a corner table with Adam, her stomach already showing, and she was laughing loudly the way she always did when she wanted attention. I almost turned around, but I decided I would not run anymore. I ordered my coffee and stood tall, and when she noticed me, she froze mid-laugh. Adam looked up too, and I saw guilt crawl across his face like a shadow, and Lila tried to smirk, but it faltered. I walked past them without a word, and I saw her eyes follow me the entire time. I smiled to myself, because I knew she expected me to crumble, but I was far past the point of collapsing again. Later that day, she sent me a message from a new number asking if we could meet and talk woman to woman. I stared at the screen for a long time before deleting the message without replying. She had made her choices, and so had I, and I chose silence over chaos, peace over noise, healing over history. That weekend I attended a small art workshop, something I used to do before marriage, and while mixing colors I started crying, and the instructor handed me a napkin without saying anything, and I realized healing was not a straight line. It was a spiral, a long winding road with sharp turns and hidden beauty, and I was learning how to walk it one step at a time. A month passed and then another, and I celebrated my 36th birthday quietly with Kara and a few friends who brought cake and flowers and laughter that did not come with knives, and I felt grateful for every moment, even the painful ones, because they led me here to this version of myself that I was finally starting to love. I heard through my mother that Lila gave birth to a baby girl and named her Hope. The irony made me laugh in the bitter way people do when they are past crying. My mom asked if I wanted to see the baby, and I said no. I wished the child a good life, but I would not be a spectator to a story that had almost broken me. My parents eventually stopped pushing, and I visited them once a month for dinner, careful not to overlap with Lila's visits. The distance helped, and over time the anger began to dull. I started taking dance classes just for fun, and I went on a few casual dates, nothing serious, but each one reminded me that the world was wide and full of people, and I did not have to be afraid to try again. I never talked about Adam on those dates, and I never mentioned Lila, because they were part of my past, not my present, and certainly not my future. Sometimes I would pass a shop or hear a song that reminded me of the life I once had, and it would sting, but not enough to stop me anymore. I had become someone stronger, someone softer too, but not weak, never weak. I got promoted at work, and my boss told me she admired how I handled everything with grace. I smiled, thanked her, but I knew the truth. Grace was not always pretty. Sometimes it looked like screaming into a pillow, or crying in the shower, or saying no when every part of you wants to say yes just to avoid a fight. Grace was surviving, and I had survived. I wrote a letter to my future self on the night of my divorce finalization. I wrote that I was proud of her, that she did not collapse, that she walked through the fire and came out whole, that she did not let betrayal define her, and that she had learned to define herself by her courage and not by anyone else's choices. I sealed the letter and tucked it into a drawer, knowing I would open it one day when I needed to be reminded of how far I had come. One quiet Sunday morning, I woke up to the sound of soft rain against my window, and for a moment I felt calm until I remembered what day it was. It was the day of the baby shower. My mother had decided to throw for Lila, even though she knew it would hurt me. I had made it clear weeks ago that I wanted no part in it, and yet my mom insisted on telling me about every little detail, as if dragging me back into the night. Mare was somehow part of her healing process. She told me they were going with a pink and gold theme, and that they had booked the same garden space we used for my bridal shower, as if recycling memories was an acceptable way to pretend everything was fine. I stayed in bed longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, wondering how my own family could be so tone deaf. Kara had already promised me that she would not attend either. She was more than a friend, she was a sister in every way that mattered, and she brought over breakfast that morning with extra whipped cream, just how I liked it. We sat on the couch watching old movies and laughing until our cheeks hurt, trying to ignore the fact that across town my sister was being celebrated for starting a family with the man who once vowed to grow old with me. Around mid-day I got a message from my aunt saying she wished I had come, and that the family missed me. I stared at it for a while before deleting it without replying. People always miss the version of you that accepts everything without a fight, never the one who stands up for herself. Later that evening, my mom called. I did not answer. She called again and again until I finally picked up, and her voice was too bright, too forced. She told me how lovely everything had been, and how Lila looked radiant, and how Adam was so attentive, and I wanted to scream. I asked her why she was telling me all this, and she said she thought I deserved to know what I was missing, as if missing it was a flaw in me, as if standing my ground made me cold and heartless. I hung up and turned my phone off and sat in the dark for a long time, remembering that garden, the one where I once wore a white dress and opened gifts with Adam by my side. Before any of this had happened, it felt like a movie I had seen once and forgotten the plot. I did not sleep that night, and when the sun came up, I decided to do something bold. I signed up for a week-long retreat in the mountains, something spiritual and grounding, a place where phones were not allowed, and the only focus was on healing. I packed a small bag and told Kara I needed space, and she understood like she always did. The drive was long, and the road winding, but as the city disappeared behind me, I felt something lift off my chest. The retreat was quiet, surrounded by trees, and the air smelled like pine and rain. The days were spent in meditation, nature walks, and journaling, and at night we sat around a fire, sharing stories with strangers who had nothing to gain from each other but understanding. There was a woman named Rachel who had left an abusive marriage, a man named James who lost his brother in an accident, and a teenager named Naomi who had run away from home because she felt invisible, and we all sat there, strangers and yet somehow family, for that one week. I told them my story on the third night, and I cried like I had not in months, and when I was done, no one gave advice, no one said time would heal. They just sat with me in the silence, and it was the most comforting thing I had felt since my world fell apart. By the end of the week, I felt different, not fixed, but lighter, like I had laid down something heavy that I had carried for too long. When I returned home, my apartment felt warmer, like it had been waiting for me, and I took a deep breath and smiled because I knew I was getting stronger. One morning, I was at the grocery store when I ran into Adam. He looked thinner, older, like someone had stolen the spark from his eyes. He looked at me like he had seen a ghost and stammered my name. I told him. I did not have time to talk, but he begged me for 5 minutes, and for reasons I still do not fully understand, I agreed. We sat at a small bench outside the store, and he told me that things with Lila were not what he expected, that they fought constantly, that she resented him for how things unfolded, and that she blamed me for making her feel guilty. I told him that I did not care, and that whatever mess they had created was theirs to live in. He asked if I ever missed him, and I said no, and I meant it. He looked away and said I ruined everything, and I said no, Adam, you did that all by yourself. I got up and walked away without looking back, and that moment felt like reclaiming something I had lost long ago. A few weeks later, I got a letter from my grandmother, who lived in another state. She said she had heard bits and pieces from my mom and wanted me to know that she was proud of me for choosing myself. She wrote that women in our family had a habit of staying silent to keep peace, and that she was glad I broke that pattern. I cried reading it, and then I called her, and we talked for an hour about everything, nothing, and I felt a connection that reminded me I was not alone in this path. Sometime after that, I began mentoring a girl named Emily through a support program. She was 22 and had just left a toxic relationship, and she reminded me so much of myself, young, hopeful, kind, and far too willing to forgive people who did not deserve it. We met once a week and talked about boundaries, self-respect, healing, and I realized how far I had come because I could now offer strength to someone else without falling apart myself. One evening, after one of our sessions, I sat on my balcony watching the sunset, and I wrote in my journal that I no longer hated Lila or Adam, that I felt nothing for them, and maybe that was the greatest freedom of all. Not revenge, not rage, but indifference, the kind that comes when you finally detach from the story they tried to trap you in. I closed the journal and made myself a cup of tea and smiled because I knew this was not the end of my story, it was the middle, and I had so much more left to write. Spring had settled over the city by the time I started to feel like a person again, and not just the shattered version of someone who used to be married, used to be a sister, used to be trusting. I had taken a part-time position at a community center, helping organize workshops for women who had gone through various stages of emotional betrayal and personal loss, and I found something deeply healing in listening to stories that mirrored pieces of my own, not exactly the same, but enough to make me feel understood. I never shared my full story there, not because I was ashamed, but because I had made peace with leaving it in my past where it belonged. One afternoon, while I was organizing a shelf of donated books, I received a call from an unknown number, and when I answered, I froze because it was my father. I had not heard his voice since the baby shower drama, and he sounded older, tired, like life had worn him down, he asked if we could talk, if I would be willing to meet him for lunch. And after a long pause, I agreed. We met at a small restaurant near the old library he used to take me to when I was a child. He ordered the same dish. He always did grilled cheese with tomato soup, and he barely looked me in the eye. He said he missed me, and that he regretted how everything had been handled, and how he and Mom had chosen neutrality instead of standing up for me. I listened silently, stirring my tea slowly, and finally I asked him if he thought what Lila did was okay. He shook his head and said no, but then added that he did not know how to handle the fallout, that he just wanted to keep the family together. I told him that protecting peace should never come at the cost of justice, and he nodded but said nothing more. When the check came, he paid for both of us and said maybe one day we could all be in the same room again without it hurting. I smiled politely but said nothing, because some wounds do not heal just because time passes. They heal when truth is spoken and ownership is taken, and I had yet to hear any of that from Lila. I walked back to my apartment that day, thinking about how many times I had excused other people's behavior just because they were family, and I promised myself I would never do that again. The next week, I got an email from a university I had applied to back in 2008, before life had turned me in another direction. They had a remote program opening for adult learners in creative writing, and they had accepted me. I read the email twice and then burst into tears, because for the first time in years I felt like I had a path that was mine, not tied to anyone else, not shaped by guilt or obligation, just mine. I enrolled without hesitation and began taking classes at night, balancing my part-time work with writing assignments that brought pieces of my soul back to life. I wrote about women who burned quietly but never turned to ash, and about rooms filled with laughter that used to echo with grief, and about starting over when the world expects you to stay broken. And for the first time I saw beauty in my own words, like they mattered. One evening, after submitting a story to my professor, I received feedback that read your writing is honest, raw, and transformative, and it made me cry because I had been so afraid that my voice had been stolen by betrayal. But here it was louder than ever. My mom called again around that time, and this time I answered. She wanted to invite me to a small dinner, just the five of us, her, my dad, Lila, Adam, and me, to reconnect. I asked her if she really thought that was possible, and she said she hoped so. I declined firmly and told her that healing does not mean walking back into the fire and expecting it to burn less the second time, and she was quiet, then asked if I hated them. I said no, I just did not trust them, and those are not the same. She cried softly, and I let her because I was done fixing everyone else's feelings. I had my own to care for now. Days turned into weeks, and my routine became sacred: morning tea, afternoon work, evening study, late night writing. And in between I was learning how to smile without flinching at memories. Kara remained my anchor, always reminding me that I was allowed to outgrow people even if they shared my blood. She helped me set boundaries and cheered when I got my first piece published in a small literary magazine under a pen name, and it felt like a piece of justice even if the world did not know it was mine. It was mine. One Sunday morning I walked past a park where I used to dream of raising kids, and I saw Adam and Lila sitting on a bench with their baby girl. She looked a lot like me in a way that made my stomach twist, and Adam looked up and saw me and waved slightly like we were old friends passing on a street. I did not wave back. I just walked on, and behind me I heard Lila whisper something that made him look down, and I felt nothing, no anger, no sadness, just space, the kind that comes after you build walls strong enough to hold your peace. I started working on a novel based loosely on my life, but with more fire, more survival, and more triumph, and writing became my church, the place I went to scream without sound, to weep without judgment, to remember without regret. I would sit for hours lost in my characters and their battles, and each time I finished a chapter, I felt lighter, like a piece of me was being rewritten in the most literal way. I found a therapist who specialized in creative recovery, and she helped me understand that sometimes the best revenge is not success, it is peace, the kind that cannot be shaken by applause or ignored by those who try to break you. One night, I received a message from Lila saying she was sorry that she had made mistakes and that she hoped we could start over. I stared at the message for a long time, and then deleted it without replying, because closure is not always a conversation. Sometimes it is silence, sometimes it is choosing not to reopen doors you finally had the strength. Close, I looked around my apartment, the plants thriving, the books stacked, the calendar filled with deadlines, and I knew I had created a life from rubble, not because I had to, but because I chose to, and I would not trade it for anything, not even an apology that came too late. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when I received a message from an editor of the literary magazine that had published my short story 2 months earlier. She said a small press was interested in seeing more of my work, and that if I had a collection in progress, I should consider submitting it. I sat frozen for a minute, the glow of the laptop screen reflecting back at me as I let that truth settle deep inside me. Someone out there beyond the heartbreak, beyond the betrayal, saw value in what I had to say, in the voice I had reclaimed from ashes. I replied with a grateful yes, and spent the next several days gathering everything I had written over the past year. I titled the collection Women Who Chose Fire, and it felt like naming not just the work, but the woman I had become. I printed each story and laid them out across my living room floor, pages of pain, pages of healing, pages that began in shadows and found their way toward light. Kara came over that weekend and helped me arrange them into a rough order, and we stayed up past midnight drinking herbal tea and talking about who we had been and who we were becoming. She reminded me again that survival is not just continuing to breathe. It's choosing to live fully, to love again, to believe in your own worth again, even when others tried to bury it under shame. I submitted the manuscript the next day, and then tried to forget about it, but every morning I checked my email like it held a piece of my soul in limbo. Weeks passed, and then one morning in early autumn, I opened a message that began with, "We would love to publish your collection," and I screamed into my pillow with joy. It felt surreal, like all the parts of my life that had unraveled were being sewn back together, but with golden thread, each scar visible but beautiful in its own way. The publisher was small and independent, but deeply passionate about telling stories of resilience, and they treated my work with care and reverence. And for the first time in years, I felt proud, not for surviving, but for creating something from the ruins, something true, something fierce. As release date approached, I was invited to speak at a panel about betrayal and recovery through art, and while I was nervous, I said yes because I had spent too many years being silenced. I stood on that stage wearing a simple black dress, hair pulled back, heart racing, and when it was my turn, I told my story, not the details, but the truth. I spoke about trust being broken, and how the people we love most sometimes harm us the deepest, and how healing is not a straight line, but a spiral. I said that art saved me, that writing gave me back my name, and that no one, not even blood, can take your voice if you refuse to give it up. When I finished, people clapped, but more than that, people cried, and afterwards strangers came up to me saying they saw themselves in my words, and that my courage gave them permission to begin again. And that night I walked home through quiet streets under golden streetlights, and I wept not from sadness, but from release and gratitude. One afternoon, a few weeks later, I received a letter from Lila, not a message, not a call, a letter handwritten on lavender stationery, like we used to use when we were girls. She said she was in therapy, that she was beginning to understand the depths of what she had done and how it had destroyed not just my marriage, but our sisterhood. She said she was not asking for forgiveness, only hoping I would read her words. She wrote that she missed me, and that sometimes when the baby laughed, she wondered if I would have been her favorite aunt, and that thought haunted her. I read the letter once, then again, and then placed it in a box with other memories, not to forget it, but to keep it in a place that would not hurt me. Every time I opened my drawer, some nights, I thought of the baby, a girl I had never met, who shared blood with me, and yet would grow up without knowing the woman I was, and maybe that was for the best, because children should not carry the weight of adult mistakes, and I was not going to play a role in a story built on betrayal. My therapist said that was a healthy boundary, and I agreed. It felt like choosing peace over guilt, and clarity over chaos. On the 1-year anniversary of my birthday dinner, the one that turned my life upside down, I held a private dinner at my apartment, just me, Kara, and a few new friends I had made through writing. We laughed and shared stories, and I cooked my favorite pasta dish, and for dessert we had cake, not a big fancy one, just a small chocolate one with strawberries and one candle, and they sang happy birthday, and I closed my eyes and made a wish, not for things to go back, not for revenge, but for continued strength for the road ahead. I opened my eyes and smiled because I was not alone anymore. I was not broken, I was whole in a new way. The day the book was officially released, I went to the bookstore and held it in my hands. The cover was deep red with gold lettering, and my pen name embossed across the top. It felt like holding my own heart wrapped in courage, and I signed a few copies. Quietly, as the staff clapped and took photos for their social media, I went home and placed one copy on my nightstand. And as a reminder of everything I had endured and everything I had created, I lit a candle, poured a glass of wine, and read my own words aloud to myself, and it felt like a ritual, like reclaiming a chapter they tried to erase. I knew the road ahead would still have hard days, moments when memories crept in, when birthdays came and went, when family tried to pretend nothing ever happened, but I was no longer that woman who waited for apologies or sought validation from people who only showed love when it was convenient. I had learned to be my own home, my own truth, and in that truth I found freedom. I still walked past that park sometimes where I saw Adam and Lila and their baby once, but I never saw them again, and maybe they moved, or maybe life simply stopped placing us on the same paths. But either way, I no longer flinched at the thought of them, because they no longer held power over my peace. And as I stood by the window watching the city lights blink softly into the night, I knew my story was just beginning, and this time I was the one holding the pen. The first official review of my book came out 3 days after its release, and I remember holding my breath as I clicked the link, unsure if I was ready to see what the world thought of the pieces of my soul laid bare. And when I read the words, I felt something shift inside me. The reviewer called it a haunting and honest exploration of feminine grief, resilience, and rebirth, and said that the writing burned with a quiet rage that never overpowered its grace. I reread that line again and again because it described not just the book, but who I had become, someone who still carried fire, but had learned how to wield it without setting herself on fire. I printed out the review and taped it above my writing desk as a reminder that even when people try to erase your voice, you can still rise louder than before. I spent the next few months traveling locally for small readings, book signings, community events, and while none of them were glamorous, they were meaningful. People would approach me with trembling hands and glassy eyes, telling me that my words made them feel less alone. One woman handed me a folded note during a reading in a library, and when I opened it later, it said, "I have not spoken to my sister in 4 years because she betrayed me, and for the first time I do not feel like I am the one who failed." And I sat with that sentence for a long time, because it was the same guilt that I had carried for months, that belief that silence meant failure, when in reality it often means survival. The more I shared my work, the more I realized how common betrayal was, especially within families, and it made me question how often women are expected to forgive just to keep peace, how often we are told to suppress our pain for the sake of keeping things looking nice on the outside. And I made it a mission to challenge that narrative every time I spoke, not with anger, but with clarity, with truth. I was invited to speak at a university panel about healing through storytelling, and I shared how writing had not just been therapeutic, but transformative. It had forced me to confront my own reflections, to name the moments I wished had never happened, and to create something beautiful from them. After the event, a young man in the audience approached me and said my story helped him understand what his sister had gone through when she was betrayed by her fiancé and best friend, and he said he finally understood why she needed space, not lectures. And I realized that healing stories do not just serve the wounded, they educate the people around them, who do not know what pain looks like in real life. That night, I walked home with the soft rain falling around me, thinking of how far I had come from that dinner table that night when everything crumbled, and how now I had rebuilt a different kind of table, one where everyone brought truth, not pretense. And one morning, I woke up to an email from an old mutual friend, someone I had not spoken to in years. She wrote that she had heard about my book and had read it, and knew without me saying who the story was based on, and she said that in her opinion I had done something far braver than revenge. I had created meaning out of loss. She also said that Lila and Adam were struggling, that the relationship was not as perfect as they had made it seem, and that sometimes karma looks like silence, not thunder. And I sat with that information, unsure of how to feel, not joy, not satisfaction, just confirmation that pain built on lies can only hold for so long, and I felt no need to see it collapse because I was too busy building something real. My writing continued to evolve, and I began working on a second book, this time a novel still rooted in emotional betrayal, but told through a fictional lens. I wanted to explore how people justify harm and how forgiveness is often demanded more than earned. I created characters who looked nothing like me, but who carried the same emotional weight, and in writing them I found parts of myself I had forgotten existed. One character in particular, a woman named Mira, became a vessel for everything I had never said out loud, and the more I wrote her, the more I understood myself. I spent late nights typing at my desk, candles burning, soft music playing, and every word felt like stitching a torn seam closed with care. One week, and I attended a women's retreat for creatives where we spent 2 days off the grid, sharing our work, our fears, and our visions, and around a bonfire, one woman asked what moment in our lives had broken us and how we found the strength to stand again. And when it was my turn, I said my sister announced her pregnancy with my husband at my birthday dinner, expecting me to collapse, but I stood up, walked out, and built a new life without either of them, and the group fell silent, and they erupted in soft applause, not because of drama, but because of power, because truth, when spoken without shame, creates space for others to breathe. I returned from that retreat with a full heart and a clear mind, and I knew then that I had done something more than just survive. I had transformed. And transformation is louder than revenge, stronger than bitterness, and brighter than any apology that never comes around. That same week, I was offered a teaching fellowship at the university to lead a short course on narrative healing, and I accepted without hesitation. Standing in front of students wanted to use writing to understand their wounds was one of the most rewarding experiences of my life, and I told them from the start that I was not there to teach grammar or plot. I was there to teach voice, the kind of voice that trembles at first, then roars, and they listened, and they wrote, and they cried, and they thanked me, and I knew that legacy was not built by blood, but by impact. One student said I helped her write about a father who abandoned her when no one else believed her pain was real, and I told her her truth mattered even if no one clapped, and that night I cried again, not from sadness but from awe at how full circle life can feel when you give it the time and space to breathe. I never replied to Lila's message. I never returned Adam's call when he reached out months later. I never looked back, and some people might think that is cold, but I call it kind, because giving energy to people who betrayed you is like watering dead plants hoping they will bloom again, and I had learned to plant new gardens, ones that flourished with care and sunlight and truth. And as I looked out from my balcony that evening, watching the sunset turn the sky gold, I whispered thank you, not to them, but to the version of me that chose herself, that walked away, that believed she was worth more than shared history and broken promises, and that kind of belief, once rooted, never dies. The seasons shifted, and I found myself embracing the slow rhythms of life again, waking up without panic, writing without bleeding, and living without apology. I had taken so much back from the wreckage that I sometimes forgot how dark the beginning had been, how sharp the silence was after the betrayal, how long the echo of my own name had rung in empty rooms. But now there was music again, soft and slow and chosen. I adopted a morning routine that included yoga, journaling, and a walk to the local bakery, where the owner always greeted me with a warm smile and a fresh croissant. And those small, consistent moments reminded me that healing is not about grand gestures but steady ones, about showing up for yourself even when no one else does. I began volunteering once a week at a shelter that supported women transitioning out of abusive or toxic environments, and though my story was different, our pain often looked the same, and when I shared pieces of my journey during circle talks, I saw Nod's tears, clenched hands slowly loosening because someone else had said what they had been too afraid to. And I never used Lila's name or Adam's or even mentioned the birthday dinner specifically, but emotions were universal, and the women understood betrayal like it was a language they had been born into. One evening, after a session, a young mother named Simone pulled me aside and said, "Your story made me feel like I was not crazy, like I was not weak for walking away from someone everyone told me to keep, and I hugged her tightly because that was the kind of clarity I had fought so hard to find in myself. I stayed close to Kara, and our friendship deepened into something sacred. She was the one who had seen me fall apart and never looked away, and she reminded me through her presence that some bonds are chosen and often stronger than blood. We planned small getaways whenever we could, short weekend trips to nearby towns where we would explore thrift shops, drink tea by rivers, and speak openly about things that once felt too raw to name. And each trip felt like rewriting memories with laughter instead of tears. One afternoon during a hike, Kara stopped mid-trail, looked at me, and said, "I hope you know how proud I am of you," and I smiled with tears in my eyes because I finally believed it, not just heard it, but felt it in my bones like a truth that had been waiting for me to be ready to carry it fully. I received an invitation that fall to speak at a major literary conference in the city, a huge milestone for any writer, especially one with only a debut book under her belt. And while I was terrified, I said yes because fear was no longer a reason for me to say no. I prepared my speech for weeks, rehearsing in front of mirrors, whispering lines into the quiet of midnight rooms, and when the day arrived, I wore a blue dress the same shade as the sky on the morning after I left my old life behind, and as I stood behind the podium looking out at hundreds of faces, I told the story of a woman who had been broken and rebuilt herself not through vengeance, but through voice. I spoke of choosing silence when it brought peace and choosing noise when it brought power. And when I was done, the room stood and clapped, and I felt years of doubt melt off my shoulders like snow under sunlight. After the event, a journalist asked if I would ever reconcile with my sister, and I said reconciliation requires two truths held at the same time, accountability and change, and so far, I had only seen regret, not repair, and she nodded with understanding because sometimes choosing not to go back is the most radical act of love for yourself. My second book was nearing completion, and this one held deeper layers of fiction and metaphor, but its heart still beat with truths I had lived through. And when I finished the final chapter, I closed my laptop and stared out the window, watching leaves fall gently to the ground, and I whispered thank you to the version of me who had not given up, who had kept writing through the pain, through the rage, through the sorrow, and into something that could be shared and understood and felt by others. I visited my parents only once in the past year during a distant cousin's funeral, and though they were civil, their eyes carried a mixture of guilt and confusion, as if they still could not fully comprehend why I had not simply moved on as they had tried to. I hugged them out of respect, not closeness, and left quickly afterward because I had learned that presence does not always mean connection, and sometimes walking away again is still the healthiest choice. I later found out from extended family that Lila had given birth to a second child, and that Adam had been laid off from his job, and that they were living with his parents temporarily, and I felt nothing, not joy, not pity, just distance, and that distance felt like freedom. I had built a life that no longer orbited around their shadows, and I protected it with fierce boundaries. One night, as I sat on my balcony watching stars flicker above, I received a message from a young writer who had read both of my books, and she said, "Your words saved me from going back to someone who broke me." And that is when I cried again, because this time it was not about my pain, but about purpose, about knowing that every sleepless night, every tear, every paragraph carved from memory had created something larger than me, something that would ripple outward long after I was gone. I leaned back against the cool metal railing, stared at the vast sky, and knew I had made it through, not just out of the fire, but into something luminous and lasting and true. It was during the winter months when the idea of starting a podcast first came to me, not as a planned project, but as a response to the growing wave of messages I was receiving from readers who wanted more, not just books, but conversations, something they could listen to in their cars during commutes, while folding laundry, or lying awake at night thinking about the weight of their own betrayals. And I realized that while the written word had given me power, spoken word could offer something even more immediate and human. So I partnered with Kara, who had a background in media production, and together we built something from scratch. The podcast was called Aftershock: Stories from the Fault Line of Betrayal, and it launched with modest expectations, but exploded far beyond what we imagined. In the first month alone, it was downloaded over 50,000 times, and by the third month we had listeners writing in from all over the world, sharing their own stories, their heartbreaks, their strength, their silence. The form. It was simple. I would read one anonymous story each week, followed by a discussion, either with Kara or with a guest expert therapist, author, or survivor, and together we would unpack the emotional layers, not to fix or judge, but to witness and honor. And I think that was the difference. We were not trying to offer solutions, we were offering space. And that space became sacred. The more episodes we aired, the more I understood that betrayal does not have a single face, it wears many masks. A parent who disowns a child for who they love, a best friend who disappears when you need them most, a partner who promises forever but means only until convenient, and each story reminded me of my own in echoes and fragments, in the way pain lingers in the background of daily life. And still we kept going. Kara and I would record late into the night, sometimes crying on air, sometimes sitting in silence before the closing music played, and those moments were raw but real, and listeners thanked us for not editing out the emotion, for letting them see what truth sounded like unfiltered. We brought in therapists who talked about how the brain processes betrayal, how trauma lives in the body, and we invited writers who explained how they turned grief into art, and each voice layered into the growing community of people who no longer felt alone. I received an email one evening from a listener who said she had been preparing to return to a toxic relationship until she heard episode 17, where a woman described choosing herself even when no one supported her, and that email stayed with me. I printed it and taped it next to the review above my desk, because both were reminders that my pain had purpose, that by refusing to stay silent, I had given others the courage to speak. The podcast opened new doors, invitations to speak on larger platforms, to collaborate on public panels, to consult on shows depicting betrayal and healing. And through all of it, I remained rooted in the same truth I had discovered on the night my world shattered, that the people who betray you expect you to fall apart because it validates their choices, but the real power lies in rebuilding in silence and showing them that your worth was never tied to their loyalty. I spoke at a national conference for women in literature where I shared the story again, this time to a standing ovation, and afterward a young woman approached me trembling and said I thought I was the only one, and I hugged her and said you never were, we just needed someone to go first. And it reminded me how many times I had felt that way in the beginning, alone, embarrassed, unsure if my story mattered, and now here I was being the voice I had once searched for. Adam tried to contact me again, this time through a mutual friend who claimed he wanted to apologize in person to explain everything, and I declined without hesitation. I did not need his words. I had closure not from him, but from the life I had created, from the healing I had chosen, and from the love I now surrounded myself with. And Lila never reached out directly, but I knew through others that she had listened to my podcast, that she had heard her story, not named but unmistakably hers. And while some might call that revenge, I called it truth spoken without shame, delivered without spite, just honesty laid bare for the world to see. Kara and I celebrated the 1-year anniversary of the podcast with a live recording event attended by over 200 people, and when I stepped onto the stage and looked into the faces of strangers who felt like family, I felt something I had not felt in years. Peace, the kind of peace that comes not from forgetting, but from remembering differently, from turning scars into maps instead of warnings. And I shared that night how the woman I used to be had been afraid of confrontation, afraid of disappointing others, afraid of being seen as difficult, but the woman I was now had learned that boundaries are not walls, they are doors with locks. You choose when to open and who to open them for, and that lesson had changed everything. The event ended with a standing ovation, and afterward, people waited in line just to hold my hand or thank me, and I did not take a single moment for granted. Each interaction was a thread in the tapestry of purpose that I had spent the last few years weaving, and it was beautiful, messy, uneven, and entirely mine. That night, as Kara and I sat in a quiet diner eating pancakes at midnight, she raised her glass of orange juice and said to healing, and I raised mine back and said to choosing ourselves, and we clinked glasses and laughed, because it was true. We had chosen ourselves, and it had made all the difference. A few months after the live podcast event, I received an unexpected invitation from a renowned university offering me a guest lecturing position for a semester in their creative writing program, and though I had never imagined myself as a teacher, something in me said yes immediately, maybe because I knew that the best way to keep growing was to keep giving, and the idea of being in a classroom filled with voices trying to find their stories felt like the right next step. I moved temporarily into a small rented cottage near campus, a quiet, leafy town where mornings began with the sound of church bells and students rode bicycles past the bookstore and coffee shops. I fell into rhythm, quickly mapping my way around the local farmers market, meeting neighbors who lent me tools and talked about weather, and I found peace in this borrowed town, far away from the chaos that had once defined my life. The class was filled with young adults, eager, nervous, vulnerable, and hungry for authenticity. And I told them on the first day that this space would not be about perfection, but about truth, and every week we explored the messy art of writing, from pain, from joy, from longing, and from memory, and I saw how their stories unfolded like petals, brave and unsure and full of color. They asked about my books, about the podcast, about how I kept going after what happened. And I told them the same thing I told myself every day, that it is not about forgetting, it is about choosing where to place your energy. And I chose creation, not destruction. One of my students, a quiet girl named Miriam, wrote an essay so raw and powerful about being betrayed by her best friend, and her voice cracked as she read it aloud in class. But she never stopped, and when she finished, the entire room was silent, not out of discomfort, but reverence, and I walked over and hugged her because I knew how hard it was to speak into the silence. I was invited to give a lecture at the campus auditorium open to the public, and I decided to share the entire story for the first time without veils or metaphors, just the truth as it happened. The hall was packed. Rows of students, faculty, and even locals who had followed my work sat in silence as I spoke, and I took them through every moment, from the birthday dinner to the aftermath, from the isolation to the rebuilding. And I told them not to pity me, but to understand that betrayal does not mean the end of your story. It means a plot twist that demands you become the author again. And at the end they stood and clapped, and a woman from the back row came up and said I never thought I would hear my own life in someone else's mouth. And I cried with her, because connection is the thread that saves us. I spent weekends walking through woods near by, often alone, sometimes with Kara, who visited when she could, and on one particular walk I came across a bench carved with the words, "Still I rise," and I sat there for hours thinking about how many times I had fallen, and how each time I had chosen to rise, not because I had to, but because I wanted to, because there was still more story to tell. During my last week at the university, the department offered me a full-time role, and while I was deeply honored, I declined, not because I did not love it, but because I knew my journey still had other chapters to uncover, and staying in one place too long would quiet the voice inside me that had fought so hard to be free. I returned home to find the podcast had grown even more during my time away, and new opportunities were waiting. A publishing house wanted a collection of essays based on episodes fans had voted as the most impactful, and I agreed on the condition that each writer would be anonymous and paid, and the publisher supported it completely, saying that truth deserved to be honored in all its forms. Kara and I celebrated with tea and laughter, and talked about taking the podcast on tour, visiting cities where our listeners could meet, connect, and share in person. And the idea lit us up like fire, because we knew it could be something life-changing. We spent weeks planning routes, booking venues, working with local shelters and support groups to partner with, and it became more than a tour. It became a movement, and each stop we made, people showed up, some with books to sign, others just wanting to be seen. And I held hands with so many women and men who whispered thank you into my ear with trembling voices. And I hugged every single one, because that was why I started all this, to turn pain into purpose and silence into sound. At one event in Chicago, a woman came up with a letter and said, "This is not for you to read now, but for when you are tired and wondering if it is worth it." And I kept that letter in my bag, and on nights when exhaustion crept in, I opened it and remembered that even when the path is hard, it is never empty. One evening, after a long drive, Kara and I sat on a rooftop watching city lights flicker like stars below. And she said, "Can you believe this started because your husband cheated on you with your sister?" And we laughed not because it was funny, but because it was absurd that such devastation had birthed such beauty. And I said, "I do not just believe it, I honor it, because without it I would not be here." And we sat in silence afterward, letting the moment settle like ash turning into gold. The moment I realized how far I had come was not in a loud public celebration or an award or even a book deal, but in a quiet afternoon at home when I opened an old box filled with letters, journals, photos, and items I had tucked away during the worst part of my life, and for the first time I did not cry, I did not tremble, I simply smiled and understood that the girl who had written those words was no longer me, but she had been the bridge to the woman I had become, and I felt gratitude not just for surviving, but for choosing to live fully, to live intentionally, and with honesty and strength. It was a surreal feeling to read the things I had written back then in shaky handwriting late at night, hunched over a kitchen table with only the hum of the refrigerator to keep me company. I had written about betrayal, about rage, about feeling invisible, and now I read those pages like echoes from a past life still important but no longer defining. I decided to digitize the letters and burn the originals, not out of hatred, but out of closure. It was time to release that weight, to let go of the paper that held my pain and transform it into something lighter, more permanent in the ways that truly mattered. I watched the papers curl and blacken in the fire pit in my backyard and felt nothing but release, not revenge, not sadness, just release. And I sat there until the fire died out and the sky turned deep with stars, and for the first time I did not feel the need to tell anyone, not even Kara. Was my moment mine alone, and that silence was powerful, stronger than any speech, stronger than any headline. That fall, I received a call from a producer working on a documentary series focused on modern betrayals and healing, and she wanted to feature my story alongside a few others. And while I had hesitated to let anyone else frame my narrative, I agreed only after she promised I would have full creative input, and the chance to approve final edits. Filming took place over a week. A camera crew followed me through my home, through the podcast studio, through the parks where I liked to walk, and into the classroom where I had returned for one more guest lecture, and they captured not just the facts but the spirit, the quiet resilience, the fire I carried without making it dramatic or pitying. And when I saw the final cut, I wept not because it was sad, but because it was real and dignified and mine. And when it aired, viewers from all over reached out, not with questions but with thanks, because they too had felt broken and had not known how to rebuild, and seeing someone else do it gave them hope. The series won an award 6 months later, and I stood on that stage accepting it in a dress I had bought not for anyone else but for myself, and I looked out into the crowd and spoke not about pain but about rebuilding, about what it means to be your own sanctuary. I said healing is not a finish line, it is a daily choice, and that the strength people admire in survivors does not come from avoiding suffering, but from facing it fully and still choosing to create beauty from the ashes afterward. A woman who looked to be in her 70s came up to me and said, "I waited 40 years to tell anyone what happened to me, and you gave me the courage." And we stood there in the hallway, arms wrapped around each other, strangers connected by the oldest kind of bond, shared sorrow and chosen survival. A few months later, Kara and I received an invitation to present the podcast at a global storytelling summit in Europe. And while I had never traveled overseas since the divorce, I agreed because something in me wanted to mark this new chapter with something bold, something freeing. And we flew out together and walked through cobbled streets and old cities and recorded a special episode live from a small theater in Amsterdam, where the crowd cried and laughed and stood with us, and I felt alive in a way I had not felt since before the betrayal. Alive not because I had forgotten the past, but because I was no longer carrying it like armor. It had become part of my story, but not my burden. I returned home to find an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from Adam, and it was not long, just a few lines, scrawled in handwriting I once knew so well, saying, "I watched the documentary, and I am sorry, and I hope you have found peace." And I sat with that letter in my hands for a long time, not angry, not moved, just still, and then I tucked it into a drawer and never looked at it again, not because it meant nothing, but because it could change nothing, and I was beyond needing anything from him. And that was the real closure, not forgiveness, not reconciliation, just detachment, the peaceful kind. I kept building, kept speaking, kept holding space for others, and every story I heard reminded me of the strength, in truth, of the courage it takes to live honestly. And I found myself mentoring young women who were just beginning to find their voice, and I told them, always speak, even when your voice shakes, because silence does not protect you, it only delays the healing. And when one of them published her first essay and thanked me in the acknowledgments, I cried again, because it meant the cycle was continuing in the best way possible. And I spent more and more time with people who fed my spirit, old friends who had stood by me, and new ones who reminded me that it was never too late to start again. We held dinners filled with laughter, no hidden tensions, no secrets, just stories and music and shared meals. And every time I sat at a table like that, I remembered the birthday dinner that had ended it all, and I would breathe deep and thank the universe for the path that had led me here, even if it had started in fire, because now I was no longer burning, I was glowing. One morning, as I sat on my balcony with a mug of warm tea in hand, the air crisp with the early signs of autumn, I got a message from Kara saying that one of our most powerful podcast episodes had been nominated for a storytelling award, and the irony was not lost on me that the episode in question was the one where I had finally spoken out in full about the night. My world shattered, that birthday dinner, that betrayal, that unraveling of everything I had once called safe. And while recognition had never been my goal, the validation felt like a gentle nod from the universe that said, you turned your pain into purpose. And the ceremony was set for the end of the month in New York City, a place I had not visited since before my marriage fell apart. But I knew in my heart that I needed to go, not for the applause, not for the stage, but for the symbolic return, the rewriting of memories. I booked a flight, found a small boutique hotel tucked away from the chaos, and packed only what I needed, nothing extravagant, just a dress that made me feel like myself and a notebook, because I had learned that reflection was my armor. The night of the ceremony, I walked into the venue with steady steps, surrounded by people who had written and spoken and created their way through storms, and I felt honored to be among them. The lights were soft, the music low, the room filled with people who had stories pulsing beneath their skin. And when our podcast name was announced as the winner, I stood still for a moment to breathe, because I wanted to remember that second forever. Then I walked up, took the mic, and told the room that stories save lives, that truth told without shame becomes a bridge, and that I had once been broken by people who were supposed to love me, but here I stood, not just alive, but thriving. And when I walked off stage, I was met with tears and hugs and quiet thank yous from strangers who had found pieces of themselves in my words. I stayed in the city for a few more days, walking the same streets that once held my tears and now held my strength. I visited an old bookstore where I had once hidden between aisles, trying to keep from falling apart, and this time I bought a novel and left a note in the back that said, you will survive this too, because I knew someone would find it when they needed it the most back home. Kara and I recorded a special episode about the award, and we received messages from people in over 30 countries saying that they had cried with us, laughed with us, healed with us. And every message reminded me that the story I once wanted to bury had become a lifeline for others, and that gave my pain purpose. My parents had stayed distant through most of the journey, watching from afar, never quite apologizing, but also not attacking, and I had learned to accept the silence as a boundary, not a wound. It was not forgiveness, but it was peace, and that was enough. My sister had given birth months earlier, and while I had never reached out to her again, I had seen pictures through mutual connections, and I felt nothing, no hate, no envy, no sadness, just distance, a space that once hurt and now simply existed. She had built her life, and I had built mine, and our roads no longer crossed. And that too was healing, not needing anything from the ones who broke you. I decided to buy a small piece of land just outside the city, a quiet plot near a lake where I could build a writing cabin and host weekend retreats for women who had lived through betrayal, who needed space to scream, cry, write, rest, and rise. And the first retreat had 6 women, all of them strangers, became sisters, and by the second night we were sitting under the stars sharing stories, so raw the wind itself seemed to pause, and I realized this was the work I had been born to do, not just to survive, but to guide others through the fire when they could not see the path. And after they left, I found A note on my cabin door that said you changed my life, and I wept again, because even after everything, even after the lies, the humiliation, the loss, I had not become bitter. I had become a lighthouse, and light attracts even in the darkest waters. One evening, I was invited to guest speak at a large event hosted by a well-known self-empowerment community, and I nearly said no because the venue was located just blocks away from the restaurant where my sister had dropped that bomb on my birthday. But I said yes because this time I would walk those streets with my head held high. I arrived early, walked past that very restaurant, and paused outside not to remember the pain, but to reclaim it. I did not go in. I did not need to, but I stood there long enough to whisper to myself, "You are not her anymore." And then I walked away to speak my truth on a stage built for voices like mine. And when I took the mic, I looked out into the sea of faces and said, "Let me tell you a story." And I told them about betrayal, about silence, about rising. And when I finished, the room stood as one, and for the first time I felt the full weight of my healing, not as a burden, but as a badge. And when I left the building that night, I looked up at the sky full of stars and felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, and nothing, not the lies, not the loss, not the years of loneliness could change that. Months passed, and I could feel the seasons changing not just outside, but inside me as well. I had begun living without constantly looking over my shoulder, without letting the past dictate how I moved through the world, and it felt like freedom, not the loud kind with fireworks and declarations, but the quiet kind that sits in your chest like peace. And one day I found myself sitting in front of my laptop, drafting an email to a publishing house that had once rejected my story before everything happened. I had written to them before, back when I had tried to get my fiction published, and though they had said no, something inside me whispered to try again. And this time I was not sending them fiction, I was sending them truth. I wrote a proposal that outlined my journey, the betrayal, the podcast, the healing, the retreats, and I sent it off without telling anyone, not even Kara, because for once I did not need anyone else's validation. And 3 weeks later I got a reply. Not only were they interested, they wanted to offer me a book deal to write a memoir, one that would be raw, honest, powerful. And I said yes because it was time to own every part of my story, not just in audio, not just in speeches, but in pages that could be held under a reader's hands. I spent months writing, pouring every part of myself into the chapters. I wrote about the night of my birthday when my sister shattered me. I wrote about the silence that followed the empty bed, the hollow mornings. I wrote about learning to live again, about Kara, about the podcast, about rebuilding, and about the long nights where I doubted everything. And when the draft was finished, I sent it to the editor with trembling hands, and when it came back, the changes were minimal, because she said my voice did not need fixing, it only needed to be heard. The book was scheduled for release in the fall of the following year, and as the release date approached, I was flooded with a mix of nerves and pride, because while I had spoken publicly before, this was different, this was permanent, this would outlive me. And on the day the book launched, I walked into a bookstore where it sat on the shelf between memoirs by women I admired, and I took a moment to breathe, to touch the spine and whisper to myself, "You did this." The launch tour took me to cities I had never visited before, and in every stop I met readers who had survived things they had never shared out loud, and who now felt seen, and that was worth everything, every tear, every sleepless night, every betrayal. And I began to understand something deeper, that maybe all the things that had broken me had made space for others to heal through my voice. One evening, while I was signing books, a woman approached me and placed her copy on the table, her hands shaking, and she said, "I left my husband this morning because I finally believed I deserved more, and I found the strength in your words." And I stood up and hugged her, because in that moment I knew the circle was complete. Pain transformed into power, silence replaced with voice. She walked away, taller, lighter, freer, and I sat there for a moment to take it in, because I had once been that woman, and now I was someone people turned to for hope. A few weeks later, I got a call from the television producers who had aired the original documentary. They wanted to option the rights to turn my book into a miniseries, and while the idea terrified me at first, I agreed because I realized my story had already traveled so far. Why not let it go even further? I worked closely with the writers, making sure the essence was protected, that story was not sensationalized, and when casting began, I was stunned to see how many actresses wanted the role because they saw themselves in me, not just the pain, but the rising, and the woman they chose looked nothing like me. But when she read the lines I had written, it felt like my soul on screen. And when the series finally aired, it became a quiet success, not flashy, not scandalous, but deeply moving. And it sparked conversations across the country about betrayal, healing, resilience, and truth. And one day I was invited onto a morning show to talk about the impact, and I sat on that couch in front of the cameras and told the world that you can rebuild from anything if you choose to keep walking, and that you do not need everyone to understand, you only need to understand yourself. And after the interview, I received a text from a number I had deleted long ago. It was from a cousin who had once taken my sister's side, and she wrote, "I was wrong and I am sorry." And while I did not reply, I felt the shift inside me, because it meant the truth had reached even the corners that once rejected it. And that was enough. I was no longer chasing apologies or revenge. I was building something far greater. Legacy. A year later, I opened a small center in my city, a space dedicated to helping women process betrayal and loss through storytelling, through movement, through community. And on opening day, as the ribbon was cut, I stood with Kara and the team we had assembled, and I knew in my bones that none of this would have existed if that dinner had not happened, if my world had not crumbled. And while I would never thank them for the pain, I would always be grateful for what I did with it, for how I turned ashes into art and scars into story. And now whenever I walked into that center, I saw women becoming whole, and I smiled, knowing that was the greatest revenge of all, not their downfall, but my rising. The months after launching the center were some of the busiest and most fulfilling of my life, as women from all across the country reached out wanting to attend the weekend retreats, wanting to share their stories, wanting to know that they were not alone. And with each new face that entered those doors, I saw a version of myself from a different chapter of my journey. Some came with tears still fresh, others with anger bottled so tight it shook their hands, and I welcomed them all because I knew exactly what it felt like to stand at the edge of your own story, unsure if you had the strength to step in. I began offering themed weekends, some focused on betrayal, some on grief, others on rebuilding. And one particular weekend stood out because it was the first time I invited a guest speaker, someone who had survived a very public divorce involving infidelity and media scrutiny. And as she stood in the circle and shared her truth, something shifted in the room. The women realized that pain does not discriminate and healing is universal. And after that, we decided to start recording portions of these weekends, not the private moments, of course, but the workshops and lessons and reflections. And we turned them into a video series that we offered online so women who could not travel could still access the healing. And it grew faster than I expected. Thousands of views in the first month, hundreds of emails from strangers saying they had watched in their kitchens, in parked cars, in bathrooms, hiding from the world, and every message reminded me that what I had created was bigger than just a podcast, bigger than a book. It was a movement. And then one afternoon, as I was sitting in my office organizing a schedule for the upcoming month, I received an email that made me freeze. It was from my former husband. The subject line was simply apology, and my first instinct was to delete it, but curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. And what I found was not an excuse, not a plea for forgiveness, not even a justification. It was a few short paragraphs saying he had seen the television series, he had read the book, and he was sorry, not for leaving, not for what happened, but for the way he did it, for the humiliation, for the silence, for the cruelty. And that he knew I owed him nothing, but he hoped I had found peace. And I stared at the screen for a long time, my hands hovering over the keyboard, unsure whether to respond. I did not need his words. I had already built my life without them. But I also knew that the woman I had become did not hold on to old fires, so I replied with a single line: "I have, and I wish the same for you." And then I closed the laptop and went outside to sit in the sun, because that was what healing looked like, not dramatic, not loud, but quiet and complete. A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at a global summit for women leaders, and the topic was rewriting your narrative, and I knew I had to go, not just for me, but for all the women who had ever felt voiceless. I walked into that massive hall filled with thousands of attendees from over 50 countries, and as I took the stage, I looked out into the sea of faces and said, I am here today not because I was never broken, but because I chose to build something beautiful from the pieces, and the applause that followed was thunderous, not for the pain I had endured, but for the courage it took to tell it. And when the summit ended, I received an offer from an international nonprofit to collaborate on building storytelling programs for young girls in regions where their voices were often silenced. And I said yes without hesitation, because I had learned that when your story becomes a bridge, you never know who you are helping cross. And over the next year, I traveled more than I had in my entire life, visiting schools, shelters, community centers, sitting on dirt floors and plastic chairs, listening to stories so raw they left me breathless. And I taught those girls how to write, how to speak, how to claim their truth. And each time I boarded a plane back home, I carried their voices with me like prayers. One day, while unpacking, I found an old journal buried at the back of my closet, one I had kept during the early days of my marriage, filled with lists of baby names and dreams and hopes. And I sat on the floor with that journal in my lap and wept, not because I missed that life, but because I had outgrown it. I had become a woman I once only dreamed of being, and that realization was everything. In the spring of 2024, I hosted the largest retreat we had ever done, 100 women in a converted barn turned sanctuary, with soft lights, warm meals, and the kind of laughter that only comes from surviving. And on the final night, we sat around a giant bonfire, and each woman tossed a stone into the flames, whispering the name of someone or something they were releasing. And when it was my turn, I held my stone close and whispered my sister's name, not in hate, not in bitterness, but in surrender. And as I let it go, I felt lighter, because I no longer needed justice or revenge or even understanding. I had peace, and that was enough. And when the fire burned low and the stars came out, we sang not like performers, but like women who had found their way home. And I looked around that circle and knew without a doubt that everything I had lost had made room for everything I had gained, and I would not trade that for anything, not even the life I once thought I wanted. The morning after that retreat, I woke up before the sun fully rose and sat on the edge of my bed, thinking about how far I had come since that disastrous birthday dinner. The memories used to haunt me in my sleep, but now they visited like distant echoes, no longer painful, just reminders of everything I had endured and survived. I stood up, stretched, walked to the window, and looked out at the mist covering the trees, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt truly calm, not the fragile calm that can shatter with a phone call, but the deep kind that comes from knowing who you are and what you have built. And as I made myself a cup of tea, I scrolled through my messages and saw one from a woman who had attended the retreat. The message said, I found myself again because of you, thank you. And that simple sentence made me cry, because I remembered how it felt to be lost, to have no idea who you are outside of someone else's betrayal. And now I was that guide for others, not because I was perfect, but because I had crawled through the dark and built a light. And that afternoon, I sat down to write the final chapter of the next book, the one that would talk about rising after the fall, not the moment of betrayal, but the rebuild after the ruins, the slow return to yourself, the decision to live for you. And I titled that chapter Standing Tall, not because of what they did, but because of what I chose. And the words flowed easily because they were real. They were mine, and I no longer wrote prove anything. I wrote because stories save lives. And a few weeks later, I was asked to consult on a drama series inspired by real-life betrayals, and they wanted my perspective, not just as a survivor, but as a storyteller. And I said yes, not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted to put anyone on blast, but because I believed that when we tell the truth, we make space for others to do the same. And when I sat in the writer's room and they asked me what betrayal feels like, I said it feels like silence where there should be laughter, like looking at someone you love and seeing a stranger, like standing in a room full of people and feeling completely alone. And I saw them nod, and I knew they understood. And when the series aired, it reached millions of viewers, and my name appeared in the credits as story consultant. And that moment meant everything to me, not because of fame, but because my Pain had become purpose, and then something unexpected happened. I was invited to a conference back in my hometown, not as a guest but as a keynote speaker, and it felt strange returning to the place where everything fell apart, but I accepted the invitation because I was no longer running, and when I walked into that venue, I was greeted by faces from my past. People who had once pitied me whispered about me, judged me, and now they were clapping and nodding, and some even cried during my speech, and I did not feel vindicated, I felt whole, and after the event as I walked to my car, someone called my name and I turned and saw my old friend Rachel, the one who had distanced herself when the drama unfolded. She hugged me tightly and said, "I am sorry, I did not stand by you back then. I was afraid," and I smiled and told her it was okay because I understood fear, and we talked for hours in the parking lot. About life, about choices, about how sometimes the people we expect to stand beside us fall away, and the strangers we never noticed become our pillars. And it felt like closure, not the dramatic kind, just quiet understanding. And one morning in early spring, I received a letter in the mail. It was handwritten, no return address, and when I opened it, I recognized my sister's handwriting, and I paused for a long time before reading, and the letter was long filled with memories, apologies, reflections, and she wrote that she had been watching my journey from afar, that she had seen the retreat series, the book, and she admitted that what she did was selfish and cruel, and that she had no excuse, but she hoped one day I could forgive her. And I folded the letter, placed it in a drawer, and sat with my feelings for days, and eventually I wrote her back a short note that said, "I have forgiven you, but I will not reopen that door," and I mailed it without regret, because healing is not always reconciliation. Sometimes it is drawing boundaries with grace and letting the past stay in the past. And a year later, I celebrated my birthday surrounded by women who had become family. We laughed, we danced, we shared stories, and at the end of the night, one of them stood and raised a toast to the woman who turned her pain into purpose. And I felt tears prick my eyes because I knew that everything I had gone through, every heartbreak, every betrayal had led me to this moment. And I was not just surviving, I was thriving. And in that quiet night, with candles glowing and voices singing, I closed my eyes and thanked the universe for giving me back to myself, not in pieces, but whole and free and fierce. Outro: this story is not just about revenge, it is about truth, pain, and rising stronger than before. If this hit your heart, then you know what to do. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories that burn like fire. Until next time, stay sharp, stay loud, stay rebel.